Greetings, students. As always, I hope you're doing well. So we are moving on, right? We're moving on to a discussion of Spinoza. We've had enough of John Locke and Descartes. Well, we've covered them as much as we can. Let's say that. We don't need to cast aspersions, but we're ready to move on for our own reasons, right? Okay, so Spinoza's full name is Baruch de Spinoza. Baruch de Spinoza. You can hear probably the Hebrew there, right? Baruch is a Hebrew name. It's important. It's an important part of Spinoza's story that he belonged to the Jewish community at one point in Amsterdam, and then he got excommunicated. More on that in a moment. Right, so that's a Hebrew name, but then another name that is given for him is Benedict de Spinoza. They're both correct. So Benedict is just the Latin version of Baruch, right? Spinoza, like Descartes before him, wrote mostly in Latin because that's what he figured people could read, right? In other words, that was still somewhat of a universal language, right? Even though, this is more than 1600 years AD, more than 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, but Latin really lingered, so good for Latin. Right, that worked out well. We need to have some language that we share, right, that we can communicate with across our native languages. As I've probably said before, English plays the role now, but Latin played it at the time. Spinoza's dates, I should say, are 1632 to 1677. So his life overlapped substantially with Descartes'. Remember, Descartes died in 1650, right? And there's a strong Cartesian influence here, right? So we don't have any reason to think Spinoza looked at Locke. Locke clearly is influenced by Descartes. Spinoza is clearly influenced by Descartes. So we're kind of looking at Descartes, then an empiricist Cartesian, and now another rationalist Cartesian. You could probably tell he's a rationalist. Again, more on that later. So Spinoza's first publication was in 1663. In that year, Spinoza wrote a book called Descartes' Principles of Philosophy, right? So even the name of the book had Descartes' name in it. This was a sort of rewriting of at least part of the Principles of Philosophy, and what Spinoza did when he rewrote it is he put it in geometrical order. Right, you noticed the ethics is in geometrical order. You get definitions and axioms and postulates and theorems and scholia, etc. Right, so that's how Spinoza started out. He took something Descartes had written and he rearranged it to make it more geometrical. Why would he do that? I think you already know, right? Descartes took mathematics and geometry to be paradigmatic, right? They give us real information. That's real science. When you look at what mathematics and geometry have been able to do, that's substantial. So Spinoza just shares those beliefs and just takes it farther. Descartes had toyed with the idea of putting things in a geometrical order, didn't quite do it, and then Spinoza actually carried it out, right? And you might recall this comes up in the correspondence, and maybe it isn't quite clear in the reading itself, but I believe it's clear in the editorial notes. The Principles of Philosophy was something that Princess Elizabeth, had pushed Descartes to write. In other words, with her questions, with her pushing for Descartes to refine his views and make them more clear, Descartes ended up writing the Principles of Philosophy. So this is a nice conjunction of things here, right? Spinoza is a Cartesian scholar who worked on the Principles of Philosophy, which is a book that Elizabeth, in her way, contributed to. So we're very much in familiar territory here with Spinoza. I hope it continues to seem that way. Some of the things he says will seem a little weird, I'm sure. Okay, so a little historical background is in order. We don't need to go over the whole historical period again because, as I already mentioned, Spinoza's life overlaps substantially with Descartes', so we won't worry about the broader picture, but I will say, with respect to Spinoza's family specifically, they're known to have fled Portugal for religious reasons. Before Spinoza was even born, we don't know the details. Spinoza didn't talk about it. We don't know how his parents talked to him about it. So again, this was before Spinoza was born. The family fled Portugal, and we don't really know what Spinoza took away from that exactly, but we do know from what we already read that Spinoza thinks a lot of religion is superstition, and he's trying to debunk it, right? So you can see that in the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics. There's a lot of debunking going on in that part of the text that we already read, right? And that's got to have something to do with his family background, one would think. It wouldn't really be credible if we said it was just a coincidence, right? Why did the family flee Portugal? Well, again, Spinoza doesn't tell us, but we know that the Portuguese Inquisition was established on May 23rd, 1536, so presumably the family was caught up in that. The Portuguese Inquisition focused on conversos, they were called, people who converted to Catholicism, but especially Jews who converted to Catholicism, right? I mean, the Catholic Church was kind of after everybody, but especially Jews, right? You've probably heard of a crypto-Jew. These are people who, in theory, I mean, how many crypto-Jews were there actually? We don't know, but in theory, a crypto-Jew would be someone who converts to Catholicism on the surface and then practices Judaism in secret. Some of that probably happened. It makes sense, but of course the Catholic Church was questioning the sincerity of everybody with Jewish heritage, right? And so there was a mass exodus. There had already been a mass exodus from Spain. It sort of seems to be the case that the Inquisition spread from Spain to Portugal. A bunch of Jews had already moved from Spain to Portugal. Then things got bad in Portugal, so that stinks. And then there was a mass exodus from Portugal, of course. And then Amsterdam was known for its religious toleration, so it's not surprising that Spinoza's family ended up there, right? And Amsterdam, by the way, still prides itself on that tradition of toleration. It was a place that a lot of people fled to, and then, unfortunately for Spinoza, and again, we don't know much about this, Spinoza was excommunicated by the Jewish community in Amsterdam. which is odd, right? I mean, excommunications among Jewish communities are very, very rare, and we just don't have information on it. Amsterdam was a tolerant place. I've already tried to explain a lot of the Jews who were in Amsterdam had fled from elsewhere, so they knew religious persecution was bad and problematic from firsthand experience. So there must have been, a deep wound there, or at least the community felt that Spinoza inflicted a deep wound on them, right? Because, again, it's just a rare thing for a Jewish community to do, and the people involved, would have already felt badly about religious persecution in general, and that kind of atmosphere that leads to religious persecution. But anyway, yeah, they kicked him out. Presumably, so one is led to speculate here, because we don't have the historical details. Presumably, it's because Spinoza was considered an atheist. Right? He throws around the word God a lot, as you have noticed, I'm sure. But then you've probably also noticed that for Spinoza, God is in everything, right? So God and the universe aren't separate. So then there's no transcendence, right? So the usual view, if you're a monotheist, whether you're a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, the usual view is God transcends the physical universe, right? But that is clearly not Spinoza's view. He's quite clear. He says that everything that exists other than God, which might be a meaningless phrase for him, everything that exists that we don't call God, maybe we should say it that way, exists in God, right? So you and I exist in God, per Spinoza. We're not just creatures made by God, but we are modifications of God, and we'll say more about that when we have said more about the metaphysics, right? Because we haven't talked about, well, what's a substance, what's an attribute, what's a mode or a modification. We'll try to get into that a little bit, and then it'll be clear what it means that we're modifications of God. For now, we'll just say, well, we exist in God, so there's no separation, right? In the Abrahamic tradition, which again means Christianity, Judaism, Islam, God is supposed to be transcendent, somewhat outside of space-time, but that's not Spinoza's view. And in fact, to be more specific about it, Spinoza says that God is extended, right? So that would have been heterodox, right? Which is the opposite of orthodox, to be clear, if you're not up on your religious terminology. So that would go against the teachings of the three Abrahamic religions, right? So it might have been a common superstition to think of God as embodied, to think of God as having a human figure, right? But for theologians, people who actually had positions in the church, their view was that, well, of course, God is pure spirit, right? We wouldn't saddle God with anything as ignoble as body. But Spinoza makes it clear that it's his view that God is extended, right? And then the point of that is to bring extension and thought together, right? God is the single substance that underlies thought and extension, right? If we could put them both in God, then we're sort of moving toward a solution of the mind-body problem. Okay, so that's a good segue into specific metaphysical points and themes here. So the first thing to say about Spinoza's metaphysics is that Spinoza is a monist. He believes in monism, right? That just means there's a single substance, right? So remember, Descartes' a dualist, so we want to contrast these things, monism versus dualism. Descartes thought that there were an indefinitely large number of substances, right? You're a substance, I'm a substance. I think for Descartes, the pen is a substance. I wouldn't see any reason to deny that. Right? The wax was a substance, a finite substance. So I'm sure the pen is as well. So for Descartes, there are lots and lots of substances, but as you'll recall, there were two basic kinds of substance, right? Thinking substances and extended substances. And that created problems, right? Once we've got these two separated out, thought and extension, Princess Elizabeth did a pretty good job. She's not the only person ever to do that, but she was there at the beginning, and we've read her, so we're familiar with her. Anyway, she did a good job of pointing out that, well, we don't know how they interact. If they're really separate and minds aren't extended, it's really hard to see how interaction is possible. So it's pretty clear that Spinoza is addressing the mind-body problem with his monism. I don't think that's the only thing he's doing, but that is certainly a goal that he has, to take care of the mind-body problem, right? So if mind and body are different attributes of the same substance, right? Like I said, they're both in God. They're both attributes of God. That goes a long way toward bringing mind and body together. If they're inhering in the same underlying substance, we're not so worried about how they could possibly, conceivably interact, even if we might have trouble with the details. I mean, with Descartes' picture, you don't know even in principle how mind and body could interact. How could it ever happen? If you assume monism and you take extension and thinking to be different attributes of the same substance, okay, that's much more promising, right? Now that said, I was already sort of hinting, that the details might be problematic. There are different ways to interpret mind-body interaction in Spinoza. Okay, so one possibility is that mind and body interact in a way that we can't conceive of, right? So there's this subjectivist view of Spinoza that'll again come up more later. We're getting there. The subjectivist view has to do with thought and extension and how they're related to substance. Is it that thought and extension are really separate from each other? Obviously, that creates problems. It created problems for Descartes. That would be objectivism to some extent. They really are these separate entities. That's objectivism. I think that's what I said. I hope so. Subjectivism is more along the lines. Both seem to fit with Spinoza's text pretty well. But anyway, the subjectivist view is, extension is one way that we're able to conceive of the single substance, and thinking is a different way that we're able to conceive of the single substance. So, it could be that mind and body interact through an underlying substance that we have no direct access to, right? That seems to go along with subjectivism, right? In a sense, mind and body aren't really that separate. That's just a matter of how we conceive things. So they interact in the underlying substance, or in other words, they just are the underlying substance, and we're carving up that substance with our own limited point of view, right? And we're seeing them as separate, but there's no problem with interaction. Now, on that view, there's not much we can say about that interaction, except that it's happening underneath the surface. But if we wanted to take a more objectivist view and insist on their separateness, mind and body really are separate, still, as Spinoza explicitly says, the order of ideas and the order of things is the same order. Okay? Hard to say exactly what that means. One way to put it is the order of ideas and the order of bodies have kind of the same structure, or they have a parallel structure or an isomorphic structure, right? So they're running in parallel with each other, right? So on that view, they don't need to interact, because whatever is happening in the mental realm is also happening in the corporeal or bodily realm, because they're running in parallel. Why are they running in parallel? Well, that again is because they belong to the same substance. So they're both expressions of God, right? That's one way to put it. These two different attributes express God's nature. So because they're expressing the same nature, they express in parallel. Bodies are different from minds, but the expressions are structured in a parallel way. That makes sense. As far as it goes, I hope it does. Okay, so we're starting to get into specific metaphysical points, so let's go with that. Let's define some of these terms, and that's probably where the lecture will end. We're already at 25 minutes here. So I just want to define some of the basic terms, make sure we understand them, and say something about Spinoza's determinism. And then that will be what we need to know about part one. So there will be another lecture on part two after we're done with part one. Okay, so part one is called Concerning God. There are 5 parts of the ethics, as you might have noticed already. And we have most of parts 1 and 2. We have all of part 1 as far as I could make out. There are a few things missing from part 2. So the editors consider this to be the real meaty stuff. I've talked about this before. The first 2 parts are on metaphysics and epistemology, and that's just what the early modern period is remembered for. So this book is a book on ethics, right? It's as if it's a kind of therapy, really. You're supposed to read the book and go through a kind of therapy, which has some parallels with Stoicism, by the way. And you're supposed to let go of a lot of superstitious baggage, and then free yourself up to embrace reality, I would say. So the book is ethics. The topic of the book is ethics. But the first 2 parts have a lot to do with metaphysics and epistemology, and our editors have favored those parts because, again, that's what the period is known for. Okay, well, I'll leave it at that. That's just enough to explain why this is happening. Okay, so part 1 is called Concerning God, as I said. So it's focused on the nature and existence of the one substance, right? Because God is the one substance. Why use that word God if Spinoza is a debunker of religion? I think he's a bit of a mystic, to be honest. He's got a very clear idea or even intuition of the oneness of things, and you can tell the book is written from that perspective. Everything is one. So I think he favors the word God because he's a bit mystical. But also because, if we were to make an argument about why this is the right word, he's using Descartes' conception of God, right? So then there's just precedent for calling this God. And what is this? Self-sufficient being, right? So Descartes quite explicitly said in Meditation 4 that God is self-sufficient being, and that's what Spinoza's primary substance is, and Spinoza gets a lot of mileage out of the substance being self-sufficient. So, looking at page 369, we're not going to get very far past that in this lecture. We have Proposition 1, Definition 3. I'll quote Spinoza here. Spinoza writes, "By substance I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself." Okay, couple of things. It is in itself, so it's self-sufficient, right? It's not resting in anything else. It's resting in itself. So it's responsible for its own existence. So this is self-sufficient being we're talking about. But also, second point, hear the rationalism. I think you can hear it. By substance, I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. Right, so the primary substance isn't conceived through extension and thought, as you might have imagined. Right, the primary substance is conceived in itself, and it is essentially a sort of fullness of being that must express itself, right? And it must express itself to the point where it actually creates infinite attributes, right? So we'll say more about that once we get past the point of self-sufficiency. The only other thing I want to say about that is the epistemology and the metaphysics are going sort of hand in hand here in a way that they often did in Descartes, so then perhaps in a problematic way, right? Or to be more specific, substance is what it is, namely a substance, partly because it's conceived through itself and not conceived through anything else. So we are making metaphysical distinctions based on how things are known, right? So I just want to point that out. I'm not going anywhere in particular with that. It was a worry with Descartes, but that was a more specific worry. He seemed to argue at one point that we know with certainty we have minds. We doubt that we have bodies. Therefore minds and bodies are essentially distinct. Spinoza obviously isn't repeating that argument, but his metaphysics is a rationalist metaphysics. He thinks any reason or any cause, right? I mean, first of all, that waffle between reason and cause, if you kind of think they're the same thing, that's a rationalist view, right? And then that waffling there where, you say, oh, well, if I have a good reason to separate them, then, that's the cause of their separation. Just being free, feeling free to move back and forth from one to the other, whether you're waffling or not, even if you're very clear, like, okay, if these are conceived separately, then they really have to be separate metaphysically. That's rationalism. Part of our knowledge just comes from reason, and this is just sort of this brute thing. This is the way the universe is, right? Part of it is known through reason. Now, turns out for Spinoza there are deep metaphysical reasons for that, right? Which maybe we'll get to in the second lecture, I'm not sure. Anyway, I really just want to highlight it because there's no specific argument we're worried about here the way we were with Descartes. Just be aware of the heavy rationalism here. Okay, so moving on. Still page 369, I told you. Part 1, definition 4. Again, I'll quote Spinoza. By attribute, I mean that which the intellect perceives about a substance as constituting its essence. Wow. Okay. So the attribute constitutes the essence of the substance, but then at the same time, substances have to be conceived through themselves, so you certainly couldn't conceive them through their attributes and then and then say that they're substances, even though you're conceiving them through their attributes, right? Attributes are tricky. So we already said, or I certainly already said, and we already discussed, if you're following along with me, I guess, that we're going to go with the subjectivist reading here, but that's controversial. Some people read the text in a more objective way. So on this subjectivist reading, an attribute is what we can grasp of the substance. So we're the ones dividing the substance into the attributes. It is not in itself divided into attributes, right? So again, God is so full of being. God is so full of being that he has infinite attributes, right? And then we grasp two of the infinite number, and that's a good point for the subjectivists. That's a point in their favor, right? Here are all these other attributes, an infinite number, right? Because infinity minus 2 is still infinity. That's just how infinity works. So there's this infinite number of other attributes that we just can't grasp, right? They're just out there somehow. We're able to grasp these two attributes, right? And so that's what we perceive of substance, right? Now I'm going to get a little more speculative here, right? Because it's a puzzle, and I want to try to solve the puzzle a little bit for you, because it might be hurting your head at this point. It certainly hurts mine a little bit. So substance is supposed to be conceived in itself, but then we have these attributes through which we grasp substance. So is substance conceived in itself or not? Well, I think that issue is resolved by maybe a number of things Spinoza says, but especially when he focuses on existence, right? So bodies exist and minds exist, and existence is another word for being. So what I would suggest to you is thought and extension are two different ways of thinking about being, right? Your thoughts exist. Your body exists. They exist in different ways, right? So you're not able to grasp pure being, whatever that is. You're not. I don't mean to make it personal. I'm not. I'll say I can't grasp pure being. I'm not smart enough. I'm not infinite enough, or whatever. I can only grasp the being of extended things and the being of thinking things, but I'm still grasping being, right? I'm still, in a way, I'm conceiving it in itself, because being doesn't depend on anything further, right? I mean, I think we could see how this bit of thinking depends on the existence of thinking, and this bit of extension, depends on the existence of extension, and so they both have existence in common, and so they both depend on things existing. It's just that we have no insight into what things existing means unless we're thinking about thought or extension. Is that satisfying? I doubt it. I can say the words, and I think it helps. I hope it helps you. It helps me. What Spinoza is saying certainly isn't meaningless, right? But it's hard to know exactly what he means. But I think if we take the subjectivist view, and so we say, well, mind and body aren't really separate attributes at the end of the day, but we pick them out when we look at substance, when we engage with substance, we're picking out the attributes that we can do something with, that we can engage with. Right, but ultimately they exist, so they have that in common, and in fact that's what all attributes have in common. So God basically is existence. I think all of that helps, and I think that's what Spinoza is getting at, although, I don't know, probably I would make some Spinoza scholar somewhere unhappy by saying what I'm saying. There's a lot of controversies in how to interpret the text properly. So I'm trying to give you at least a consistent way through. Okay, determinism. I said I would say something about determinism, so I'll say that, then I'll say something about what a mode is. So, God must express himself, because he's perfect, self-sufficient being, and I'm sorry I keep saying he. I'm just going with what Spinoza says. There's really no reason to give this God a gender, right? But it's conventional to say he, so I won't keep commenting on it, right? So he, she, I don't really care. He, she is just so full of being that these infinite things follow. And if God were different, then different things would follow, but God is perfect. Therefore, whatever is must be. I mean, that's basically what it comes down to. That's what the determinism comes down to. Everything that exists is an expression of God, pretty directly, right? Since everything exists in God, so it's just as good as it can be, and it has to be the way that it is, and it can't be different, and it can't be better, right? And that's just how it works for Spinoza. Although, you know, he's saying this conventional term. He's saying God is perfect. Therefore, everything must be as it is an expression of God. But what does perfect mean for Spinoza? I would think for him that's just a synonym for self-sufficient being. So a different way to put it is everything that can exist must exist and does exist from God's point of view. We're in time. God's not. So that opens up a different way to look at the same issue, right? So for God, the universe is spatio-temporal, and it's all laid out at once. So God's not in time. So it just exists all at once for God. So of course it can't be any different from God's point of view. And also Spinoza makes a point of saying God doesn't make decisions, right? God doesn't have a will. I mean, it turns out we don't have a will either, except in a pretty weird sense that, again, I think I'll get to in lecture 2, but we're not there yet. That's part 2 stuff. So we're still in part 1. Let's just say God doesn't make decisions because that assumes that now is different from later, right? In order for you to make a decision, you're in this moment and you're thinking, I'll do this to achieve this, right? And what you'll do and what you'll achieve are both in the future, right? Separate from the present moment. That's not how it works for God. God exists in eternity. Time doesn't pass, so there's no future, there's no past, so God doesn't make decisions. So that helps, I hope, with the determinism. Okay, finally, page 369. Hey, we're getting real far here. No, sorry, we've covered a lot of ground, but I really just wanted to quote the definition, so we keep coming back to page 369. There Spinoza writes, by mode I mean the modifications of a substance, that is, that which exists in and is conceived through something other than itself. Okay, so of course there are textual controversies here as well. So I'm just going to give you a view that is coherent. So the view in this course is, well, a mode is what Descartes calls a finite substance, right? Basically, it's something coherent enough to endure through time, to endure through some changes in its properties. That is a controversial view. You could probably already begin to see why it's controversial, but it makes sense. So to be more specific, I'm a modification of God, you're a modification of God, or I'm a mode of God, you're a mode of God. The piece of wax is a mode of God. This pen is a mode of God. Right, so what this view has going for it is, some things have some amount of independent existence, right? So God is self-sufficient being. I have a bit of self-sufficiency. So by analogy, at least, you could call me a substance, which is the way Descartes goes. And then picking me out as a mode, that guy there, he's a mode. He's a mode of God. You would have the same reasons for doing that, right? Well, at least that's something we could pick out as having a certain amount of self-sufficiency. Look, that guy over there used to have thick brown hair. Now it's thinner and whiter. And, he used to read a lot of science fiction novels and go on and on about them. And now he's on this philosophy kick, which he's been on for a couple of decades. And he goes on and on about that. My point is, sorry for the autobiography, my point is, certain things, certain nexuses, if that's a word, or what is the plural of nexus? Certain conjunctures of properties endure over time. And some of the properties come and go and some of them change. But we do get these conjunctures, constellations even, of properties that remain somewhat stable, right? So I think that's what Spinoza is picking out when he uses the word mode. I mean, it's something that exists. It is conceived through and exists in something other than itself, namely substance, but we're able to pick it out as existing, right? So I think it makes sense to draw a parallel between Cartesian finite substances and Spinozistic modes. That's the view in this course, right? But there is another common view that, taking the quote at face value, a mode is anything that exists that's not independent. So I'm not specifically a mode. Rather, there's a bunch of thoughts about Spinoza going on here, right? And each one of those is a mode. And there's like white hair-ish stuff, like thin, wispy white things here. Those are modes. Insofar as we can distinguish the wispy things from each other, those are modes. So in other words, it could be that a mode is any kind of spatial or mental property that we could pick out at all. Not one that seems somewhat stable, which I thought made sense. But again, another view is any fleeting property at all is a modification of the basic substance that's God. I mean, that view makes sense too. So I'm not going to remember which Spinoza scholar said this, but rather than a cat walking through a room, that's one way to talk. You could talk about four-leggedness and furriness showing up at this spatiotemporal point, and then this conjoined spatiotemporal point a moment later, right? Instead of a cat moving through the room, in other words, to be clear, in case I didn't beat you over the head enough with this idea, you can talk about a cat moving through the room. That's taking cats seriously as real existing things in their own right. But yeah, maybe fuzziness, right, showing up at this time and place is a modification, right? Enough to be a mode. Maybe it has enough existence that we could just call it a mode. And so there's some fuzziness, there's some four-leggedness, there's some whiskeriness, there's some dry-tonguedness, right? I don't know how finely we want to distinguish our modes here, but you get the idea, right? So one view is modes are somewhat stable, enduring through time, so they're like Descartes' finite substances. And then another view is, there's thought and there's space, and there are all these different properties at different times in the realm of thought, and all these different properties at different times in the realm of space, and those are the modes. And if you see patterns, that's on you. It is what it is. Everything is one, so why not? Why not go the radical route here and say, I'm not a mode. Just these white whiskers and these fleeting thoughts of Spinoza, those are modes, right? But what seems to be a specific enduring collection of modes is from, of course, the point of view of eternity, nothing much. So there, I've managed to end on a self-deprecating note. So I don't know, I think that's fun, if nothing else. All right, I hope this was okay for you. I think we got somewhere. And be ready for a second lecture. It's coming. Thanks. Bye.